As for my story, I was born in that Hewlett home in Snowflake, Arizona. We were just a typical Mormon family. Always our lives were centered around the church. I had three older brothers and one younger sister. And then after we moved to Provo, my youngest brother was born. I did have an older sister, but when she was 8 years old and I was only 2, she was playing with a group of friends. They were jumping on a bed in a second-story room, and she fell out the window down to the ground, and she died the next morning. It was very traumatic for my family, especially for my mother. Daddy, of course, carried her home. When I was 3, my grandmother lived in San Francisco, California, and my mother took me with her on a train to California to help her overcome her trauma from Joyce's tragic accident. I think I told you about Daddy, about the decision they made to move to Kenosha, Utah. That was when I was just 4, maybe 5 years old, that we moved to Kenosha. These were both very small towns, and there weren't a whole lot of, well, there were plenty of children around, but my friends were my brothers and my sister. That's who I usually played with. The neighbor children used to gather around our home. We played all sorts of outside games, usually. Kick the can, no bears are out, that kind of game. And when we were in Provo, we were out playing one day, and I fell and broke my collarbone. That day, my dad was cutting a neighbor boy's hair, and he had to stop right in the middle of that haircut to take me to the doctor. That kid had half of his hair cut for several days till Daddy got around to finishing that haircut. My mama got Sue and I both started playing the piano, and Mama would have us play for company. When the company would come, she would always have us play the piano for them. And she would tell them that we would quarrel over who was going to practice, because the other one usually ended up washing the dishes. And more often than not, they would say, well, we can tell who washed the dishes. Sorry, it was me. I was always smart in school for some reason. I don't know why. I always did well. School was never a problem for me. But when I started school, my mama had already taught me to read. So they put me in the 2nd grade instead of the 1st grade. Whether this is good or bad, I don't know. That's beside the point, but that's what they did. And when I was in the 3rd grade, my teacher had everybody reading out loud, taking turns reading. And I came to the word W-H-O-A, whoa, and that's what I said. And my teacher let me know that that word was not whoa, it was hua. So that's been kind of a joke in our family. Her name was Miss LaRue, and we decided that Miss LaRue said she went to BYU. Well, she may have gone to BYU, but she didn't graduate from college. When I was just 16, and I was a senior in high school, A girlfriend invited me to come over to her house on a Sunday afternoon to meet her cousin from North Carolina. Well, that was when I met this wonderful Southern gentleman who won my heart. Our first date was to General Conference in October, and we kept dating steadily through my senior year of high school and doing all the high school things. Wilbur went home for Christmas that year. He wanted me to go home with him, but my mother would not consider that. But when he was going home that year, he wrecked his car. So when he came back to Provo, we were without transportation. And he lived on 2nd South and 6th West in Provo. And he would walk all the way from there up to Upper Campus. I don't know how to tell you where Wymount Village was at the time, but it was a long ways. He would walk up there, we'd walk back to town to go to a movie or whatever. He'd walk me back home, and then he would walk home to 6th West. And it was one of the coldest winters on record in Provo. But I think he really was struck on something. He proposed to me, and then in February he gave me an engagement ring, and then he received a letter from his father about going on a mission. He asked me what I thought, and I told him that my parents had always said that missionaries make the best husbands. And so I guess I was impressed that he wanted to be a best husband, and I agreed to wait for him. Now, waiting for a missionary is not easy. That's not an easy way to have an engagement, but we made it. We waited it out and were married in the Salt Lake Temple just 1 month after he returned to Provo after his mission. When we got married, Wilbur still had 2 more years of college. We were in a young married group. This group decided to visit as many temples as we could. So each month we would go to a different temple. There were not nearly as many temples as there are now, so it didn't take long for the months ran out. But that was one of the highlights of our first 2 years together. Just 1 year after we were married, Noreen joined our family. Then the next year, Dina came along. That was the year that Wilbur graduated, and we were making our plans to move to North Carolina. When Dina was just 6 weeks old, we headed out, pulling a homemade trailer with all of our stuff in it. We went through Arizona to visit Uncle Chad and Uncle Roger, and it was there that I went through one of the worst thunderstorms that I've ever experienced. I was scared to death, and Wilbur was going crazy. He had a crying baby and a crying wife. But we finally made it through that one. And we traveled across the country that way. We arrived in North Carolina just in time for school to start. He had a job as a school teacher at Franklin School, and we got to North Carolina just barely in time. He quickly became involved in church leadership. In fact, before we left Utah, he was asked to be a counselor in the branch presidency out here. As the babies started coming quickly, I had the responsibility of taking care of the children in church because Daddy was always on the stand. he used to come home. Well, back then there was priesthood meeting at 8:30 and then Sunday school at 10. So he would go to priesthood meeting and then come home before 10 so he could take me and the children to church. He used to sing. I don't know if I can sing it or not. I got two girls, Dana and Noreen. I got two girls, the prettiest you've ever seen. I've got two girls, Noreen and Dina Sue. I've got two girls, to me they'll always be true. I think he made up a song for each one of his children, but I won't try to sing the rest of them. That was bad news. We lived in the little pink cabin behind Grandpa's house for the first year we were out here. But our first summer out here, which was 1954, Daddy asked Clyde Gammons to build us a house. And so they got the house built. I don't know who all helped, but Clyde was the main one. And we moved into the house in September of that year. And that was the year that Hurricane Hazel arrived. About a week after we had moved into the house, and we didn't have any heat. And it was kind of, well, a memory to have. But we've been here ever since. That's been over 60 years now. We've done a few things to the house, of course, and it still meets our needs. In 1965, we had the basement refinished and could spread out a little bit. Jennifer was the baby. She was born in October of '64, and there was no bedroom space available for her, so we put her in a bassinet in the hall upstairs until the basement was finished and the bigger kids could move downstairs. Then she had a bedroom. Your dad continued in church leadership. In 1957, he became the branch president. Then 4 years later, we were made a stake and he was ordained a bishop. He served in that capacity for 8 years. Then he was on the High Council and traveled all throughout this part of the state, various assignments and stuff. Later he served as the state clerk, Winston-Salem state clerk, for a few years. Then in 1980 he was called by Bruce R. McConkie to be the state patriarch. He served in this capacity until 1995, when we left the area to fill our missions together. There were times during the years you were all young that I used to wonder if I would have opportunity to serve in the church. But I realize now that I did my share too. Raising my family was my biggest priority, as it should have been. But I also served in the auxiliaries too. I was a primary teacher, I don't know how many years, a den mother for many years. I was the Ward Relief Society president 3 different times, and I don't know how many times I was a counselor to the Relief Society president. Teacher in many of the auxiliaries. I was a state Relief Society counselor and a state primary counselor. I don't know if I accomplished anything, but I served too. Daddy has always done a good job of providing for our family. In college, he majored in education, so he was a teacher until 1966. Okay. Anyway, he was a teacher most of the years that we've been here. And then he was convinced by Geneva Gold that he could be of assistance to her and Ray in their business. So he became their bookkeeper. He caught on well and did everything he could for them, saved their business at that point, and worked for them for several years. When they declared bankruptcy, he went out on his own, worked for Jim Bray for a year or two. Then he got out of the bookkeeping business and he decided to be the church custodian. And at that time, the church custodian was drawing a paycheck, and we lived from one paycheck to the next, but we made it, we got by. And then the church custodian business changed a lot over the years. At one point, he was the custodial foreman for our state, and he would travel all through the state helping them with their custodian problems. So if his name had been Norman, he would have been Norman the Mormon foreman. But he's not Norman, so I guess he was Wilbur the Mormon foreman. As for me, I stayed home. He was able to support the family, and I stayed home all the years that you were small, and I enjoyed the time that I could be with all of you in the home. But I started working. I worked for Wendy's for just a few months, and then I decided to be a Tupperware lady. I did that for 10 or 15 years. I was selling Tupperware. I qualified to drive a company car, which was a blessing to us. And on the side, I was working for the temporary services. They would call me when they had a job. I spent 6 or 8 months working for Proctor Silex in their office. And then I got a job with Dr. John Hodges, and I worked for him for 4 or 5 years. I was their receptionist. I used to say that people limp in and dance out. He made them feel so good. But all of that stopped for me when we went on our missions and I didn't work anymore, public work. I will finish by saying that Daddy kept on working even after we came home. He was mowing yards for people, and that was his main job up until the time he was 85 or 86. He was mowing yards for people. And when he was younger and teaching school, he used to have part-time jobs too. He worked in a grocery store, in the meat department of a grocery store, so he was a butcher. When he was in college, when we were in Utah, he used to work in the ice plant, and he drove a taxi. When I used to struggle with my children in church, there I'd sit with a whole row of kids and reaching and stretching and trying to keep them quiet in church. I'd come home soaking wet with sweat. Someone told me, I can't remember who it was, but somebody told me, said, "You think you're not doing any good, but when you take a basket to the river to get water, you may not get much water in the basket, but you get it wet. And that's the same it is with your children. They may not be getting everything out of church, but they're in church where they're supposed to be."